Good morning, class. Coming to you from the Elfin Forest Nature Preserve. This area is on the northern end of Los Osos. And today we're going to be walking around and learning about this area. So this area, before it was purchased, was just a private land, but it was just open for off-roading actually. Folks used to come out here with ATVs and motorcycles, and if you've been out to the Pismo dunes, you know it can cause quite a bit of damage. And so literally none of these native plants were out here during that time. This area was eventually purchased in the late 80s and early 90s. It was a multi-step process. In 1987, about 51 acres of land was purchased and is addition to Morro Bay State Park. In 1994, 7.2 acres on the western end was bought by the State Lands Commission, and an additional 32 acres belongs to the County of San Luis Obispo. So there's a lot of different agencies involved with the land out here. As you can imagine, it does bring up some issues as far as managing this location. So they have little entrances here at each street. The streets dead end into the forest, and there's pathways from each street to get into the forest. So the Elfin Forest is partly managed by this group that's called SWAP. SWAP stands for Small Wilderness Area Preservation, and it was a group that was formed in about 1985. And this is really just a bunch of local citizens that were very concerned about what was going on out here. They probably lived in some of the houses along the edge here, and they saw a lot of the destruction that was going on out here. So this group formed to help start to raise the money to be able to purchase the land. They ended up having to raise about $1.6 million to be able to purchase this land, and it took them about 9 years to be able to do that. So it took them quite a bit of time to be able to do that. But they were an important part of the puzzle here in the purchasing of this land and converting it into a small wilderness area. So we'll see the boardwalk out here. The primary reason for this boardwalk, similar to what you see out at the Sweet Springs Preserve, is to focus the traffic. Unfortunately, people can love areas to death, and if you have people just walking out everywhere through the area you're trying to preserve, you're going to cause lots of damage. And so this boardwalk just focuses people's pathway. It also makes it ADA compliant, which is fantastic because you will see people out here in wheelchairs and things like that. So it's a great way to lessen the impact of people visiting an area, but also make it more accessible to lots of other folks. So this area was definitely used by the Chumash and possibly Selenian Native Americans. As we get down further into this zone, we'll see some oak trees, and there's definitely acorns that were harvested off of those oak trees. We also have a couple creeks that enter into the back part of the bay here. Towards this direction we have Los Osos Creek, and back over that direction we have Chorro Creek. So once again, this is probably a great place for the Native Americans to live. There was access to fresh water, there was access to the bay, there was access to the acorns, which they use for food. And so this probably wasn't a permanent area for them to live in, but it was certainly most likely a seasonal area where they would come in here during certain seasons when it was most productive, probably during the acorn season, and they would live here for several months. And we'll see some evidence of their existence here a little bit later on. So lots of plants out here that they could use. Some of the ones we'll see later are lichens. Lichens have a natural antibiotic component associated with them, and they used to use those to help treat wounds and to also to help make a diaper for the young ones. So a little board here talking about some of the different events that you can do out here. Some of the birds, the special birds that you can see out here. They have docent-led walks. I think it's the first Saturday of every month. So lots going on out here at the Elfin Forest. So kind of a funny story about the Elfin Forest. When I first started taking my daughter here when she was about 2-year-olds are silly, and I used to say, Zoe, we're gonna go to the Elfin Forest. And being a 2-year-old, she thought I was saying elephant forest. And so for years, and actually still to this day, we'll go, hey, let's go to the elephant forest. And it's kind of a funny inside joke for our family. So we're cruising along here. See some of the plants we saw yesterday. Here we have the ceanothus, right? This is the soap plant. Once again, the Native Americans used to use that as a type of soap. Back here, see if you can guess it. Yeah, that's the black sage. Black sage. All right, this is a pretty common plant in this area. And we see some of the blooms here on the black sage.
Winston.
Pretty cool. And once again, very aromatic, right? You squeeze the leaves. Nice smell here. And so here's a sign talking about the Native Americans that used to live in this area. It also has a good description of the different habitats we find in this area. And so we're at the very top of the area now. This is really just an ancient sand dune up here. And as we move down closer to the shore, we're going to eventually get into a wetland. So we'll keep cruising along here, looking at the native plants. This is another native plant. We haven't seen this one yet. This one's called chamise. And I'll put a smelling on that one when I get back on the computer. So chamise is a very common plant here in this zone. The bright orange flowers here, lots in the distance. That's the one that will stick to your forehead. Anybody? Anybody? That is the sticky monkey flower. All right, more of the black sage here. Ceanothus. Chamise. Sticky monkey flower right here. Oh, here's our good friend, the sagebrush, right? Remember, that's not a true sage. That's the sagebrush. Smells like sage, but it's not. All right, continue back on the trail. Talk a little bit more about the history of the area. So the SWAP group, the Small Wilderness Area Preservation Group, when they got involved with this area, they were the ones that really worked hard to restore the ecosystem. And of course, what that meant to do first was to take out the non-native species. So lots of non-native species were in this area. There was ice plant in here, there was veldt grass, and the Saharan mustard. So there was a variety of different types of non-natives. And so they had to come through here and remove those non-natives, which was just a lot of physical work. Literally many thousands of hours were spent by these folks to remove these non-natives. And they actually have a group here called the Weed Warriors. And you can come out, I think it's a second Saturday, I'll have to look it up, but that's one day a month, and they come out here and basically pick weeds. If you want to call it something a little more fancy, we can call it non-native species removal. But really all you're doing is you're coming out here and you're removing weeds, which is very beneficial because it can allow the native organisms to be able to thrive. So they had to come in and plant the natives back in this area, and they wanted to keep the genetics the same, so they actually came through and gathered seeds from throughout this area, and they started planting them throughout the entire ecosystem. So they kept the genetics similar to what was already here. And just like they had to do out in Sweet Springs, they had to water these plants for up to 2 years. And they also had to continue to remove the non-natives as they tried to invade and grow over them. So as we drop down here, we're gonna start to see a little bit of a vegetation change. On the top, we were in like a chaparral type of a habitat. As we're moving down here, we're getting down into an area where there's not quite as much wind. At the top there, you're gonna have lots of wind, lots of sun, and it's sandy soil, as we can see. So there's not a lot of great water retention, so the water just kind of flows right through it. So at the top of the hill, with lots of sun, lots of wind, which causes evaporation, low moisture levels, it's very stressful on the plants. So you have to have types of plants that are very adapted to drying out and living with low amounts of soil moisture and water. So just reviewing once again, that's the black sage, that's the ceanothus, or the soap plant. Continue around, we start to see some bigger trees starting to pop up here, right? So these are the coast live oaks. So some of these coast live oaks are quite old, but once again, because of these environmental constraints of having to live in this area that's just, it's not the best soil, it doesn't have the best moisture, there's lots of wind, they are stunted in growth. And that's why we call this the Elfin forest. It's called the Elfin forest because the oak trees here are elfin, or they're kind of small. This is about as big as they get right here. And so these trees, because of the severe environmental constraints on their growth, they just don't get very big. A small tree like this could be literally several hundred years old. It just doesn't have the capacity to grow very big in this habitat. We can also see how these trees are shaped. You can see they're kind of sloped upwards. This is called wind pruning, right? The predominant wind direction is northwest off of the ocean, this direction. And so as the wind comes in, it's very, very strong as it first hits the tree, and it tends to break off the branches, but every branch in front of the other one kind of protects the one behind it. And so the ones behind it can grow a little bit taller, a little bit taller, a little bit taller, and that's why you see this angled growth as you go with the wind. So that's called wind pruning, and that also stunts the growth of the trees out here. So now we're getting down towards the bottom area, and we have a lot more oak trees in this zone. This transitions into what we call an oak manzanita complex. So we have oak trees throughout this area, we have the manzanita throughout this area, hence why we call it the oak manzanita complex. More sagebrush here, right? So here's the sage. Let's get a good whiff of that. Delicious. All right, we can see the oak trees are happy that it's raining. It's been a dry winter, but then we've had a good shot of rain here the last couple of weeks. And you can see here's the pollen that's being sent out by the oak trees. All right, so the black sage over here, sagebrush, ceanothus. So we're gonna drop down here a little lower, and the further and further we drop down, the more soil moisture there's going to be, and the soil itself is just going to be a little bit better. So both sides of us here, we have the coast live oak. Oh, we have that vine again. You remember what that vine is? Yeah, that's that wild cucumber, right? That's the wild cucumber again. There are some ferns, and the nice part about out here is there's quite a few little signs. So this is a fern, a native fern to this area called the bracken fern. And they definitely require a good amount of moisture and shade. They're not going to like to be exposed to the direct sunlight. So the ferns that you see are always going to be in a shady spot that has a little bit more moisture. So continue down through this area. Got the oak trees. Ooh, I hear some birds flying around. All right, we're coming up to probably one of my favorite spots in the forest. Once again, some cool signs here talking about the acorns and how the Native Americans would use the acorns. All right. Here is our manzanita again. This is the Moro manzanita. You see this kind of fuzzy bark here. All right, so this is a beautiful little spot in here. Apparently, the story goes this is one of the areas that helped inspire a lot of people to donate money to the swap group, because they would bring people back in here, and apparently they had a small orchestra playing, and they served meals, and they got several of their sponsors to donate money because they could see how beautiful this place was. So one of the interesting things that you'll see here is that it looks like these trees are just kind of haphazardly just growing out of the ground, growing along the ground, popping up out of the ground. And so sometimes it's difficult to tell if you're looking at a lot of different trees, or if you're looking at one tree that's just growing out from several different directions. So you can see some of these branches, like back over there, it's probably from that tree there, and it grows sort of along under the ground and then pops back up way over there. So this literally could just be 2 or 3 trees over here, or it could be 15 or 20 trees. It's kind of hard to tell. If you were to do some genetic analysis, you could probably figure that out. Definitely a low bridge right there. I used to have a pad on that, but somebody stole it. So I want to talk a little bit about all the agencies that are involved out here. As I mentioned, State Park owns some of the land. State Lands Commission, County of San Luis Obispo, the Coastal Commission is also involved out here, the Environmental Protection Agency, the Morro Bay National Estuary Program, and the California Conservation Corps has also been involved out here. So there's a lot of different groups that are out here, and unfortunately that can make doing work out here and getting things done pretty tough. And it can cause a lot of headaches for folks that are really trying to do any type of work out here, just because there's so many different agencies. If you do one thing, you have to get approval from another, and unfortunately I've heard stories about nobody wants to take responsibility, so everybody just says, hey, go contact them and tell me what they say, and then the other agency says exactly the same thing. So this has been an interesting area. As we can see by the sign here, this is Celestial Meadow. So Celestial Meadow is an area that's slowly been filling in with vegetation over the years. When I first started coming in here 15-20 years ago, there was a lot of open space in here, and now it's just been slowly filling in over time as a natural process of succession happens. So succession is just the natural regrowth of organisms following either a disturbance or just like maybe like a natural filling in of a wetland, converting into a meadow, converting into a forest. And so if you're starting from scratch, we call that primary succession. If you're starting after a disturbance, a moderate disturbance, then it's called secondary succession. So this definitely would have been secondary succession because the area had intact soils and some grasses and things like that. And over time, just some larger shrubs and plants have filled in the spaces. You can see the ceanothus is blooming here. Some nice blooming ceanothus back over that direction. So these are these white blooms here is the ceanothus. What else do we call it? A soap plant. Soap plant. All right, cruising back a little bit further. So the boardwalk was started in 1998 and completed in 1999. It's a very extensive boardwalk, and it was constructed by the California Conservation Corps. If you don't know about them, they are a group of young folks that go around and do conservation projects. And they do a lot of great work around the state. A lot of trails, a lot of boardwalks that you see were built by the California Conservation Corps. Ooh, there's a bird up there. Let's see if I can figure it out. Ooh, I do not know that bird. A very distinctive call. We'll see if I can figure it out later on. I do have a bird app on my phone, but I'm not sure what those ones are. I'm not the best birder, unfortunately. I know a lot of the ocean birds, but a lot of the birds in the forest here I don't have a good idea of. So we got black sage again here. Ooh, look at all the little apples. All right, we know that is what? Yes, the manzanita. More coast live oak. You can always tell the oak trees because of these leaves. They're very, very hard and waxy and tough. That's a great adaptation for living in a dry climate. So it prevents a lot of moisture loss. All right, here we go. Leaves of 3, let it be. But it's hairy, so we know it's a berry. Yes, that is the wild blackberry. All right, some poison oak popping up here in certain places too. It's actually looking pretty good out here after the rains we've had this month. I'm sure if I was out here 3 weeks ago before those rains, it would have looked much drier and not as many things would have been in bloom. So lots of little pathways here. We'll continue out this direction. So getting back to all the government agencies, I've heard lots of horror stories about trying to get work done out here. Ooh, that was a mosquito. Definitely some moisture out here. So it's just difficult to get work done. There's so many agencies involved. It's difficult to get permission, and then oftentimes nobody wants to take responsibility for what's happening out here. All right, so pretty soon here on our right, we're going to see evidence of one of the organisms that lives in the forest. Back in there, I think. Oh yeah, there it is. Walked right by it. All right, so over there you see that there's a pile of sticks, and while that may just look like a pile of sticks, it's actually a home. There's a rat that lives out here called the dusky-footed wood rat, and it builds this huge home, and it's actually more of a condominium because more than likely this is a female's condominium, and she lives in one part and her offspring, who could be a couple years old now, live in other parts. And so these large homes that they build out of all these sticks have lots of in and outs. So if predators tried to come in, they have alternate routes to get in and out. And it's obviously a very protected place for them to live. So that's a dusky-footed wood rat. I'll see if I can get a picture and post it with the video later on. But they're pretty good size. They're up to probably 18 inches long or so, maybe even a little bit longer, including the tail. So as we get up here a little bit further, we're going to see some evidence of the Native Americans who used to live in this area. So when you look over on the ground in these zones, we'll see that there's lots of shell fragments on the ground. So all these shell fragments are naturally occurring out here. Somebody didn't go eat a bunch of oysters and throw these shell fragments out there. So you may know what shell fragments are called when we throw them on the ground. Sorry, when the Native Americans threw them on the ground. They're called middens. And so these middens are basically, it kind of sounds bad, but they're basically Native American garbage dumps is what they are. And so these middens are just areas that the Native Americans lived in, and they would eat the food, and they ate a lot of shellfish, of course, and the shells last a long time. So as they threw all these things on the ground over hundreds and hundreds of years, they're going to last. And some of these areas you can see charcoal indicating they had fires. You can find bones. Some of these areas you can find abalone shells, lots of oyster shells, clam shells, snail shells, limpet shells, all sorts of organisms. And you see the shells because they don't break down over time, at least as quickly. And so they're going to last a long time, and that's why we see those in the forest here. So all over the place here, right? They definitely like this area. So lots of shells throughout this zone, and those are the Native American middens. So these middens are actually really interesting archaeologically and biologically. All right, so a little bit of a storm coming in today. This is where Choro Creek and Los Osos Creek dump out. I'm gonna pause it here and put my rain jacket on because it's starting to rain a little bit. All right, so I was getting ready to talk about the importance of the middens, both archaeologically and biologically. So archaeologically, they obviously give you an idea of the fact that people lived here and what they were doing in this area. And then biologically, they're important to look at, what species were here, thousands of years ago. So this can show you the different types of species that were living in this area, and if there's been change to what we see today. And so there's some interesting information that can be gathered from that. So lots of great informational signs once again, showing different species that are out here. There's kind of this running theme of the Native American family and what they were doing out here. So as we look out over the bay, we can see once again changing of habitats. Like we visited yesterday, that the flat area down there is the salt marsh, right? So that's the area that's inundated by the high tides, and it's about high tide right now. A little bit closer, it's a little hard to see here, but you're going to have a wetland habitat that's freshwater. And that's basically the fresh water that's filtering down out of the hillside and eventually flowing into the bay. Some cool geologic history of this area is shown by this map. And the crazy thing to think about was that during the last ice age, when a lot of water was locked up into ice, the shoreline was way out here. It could have been as much as 6 to 8 miles offshore than what it currently is. The current shoreline is here. Here's Morro Rock, and the sea levels were 200 to 300 feet lower during the last ice age, right? So this is present sea level here, and this is what the sea level was 15,000 years ago. So up to 300 feet lower. And so it's interesting to think about that, because at that time, the shoreline was way out there. And so when you think about, well, why don't we see more ancient Native American sites along the coast that are perhaps 8,000 or 10,000 years old? Well, they're underwater because they're out there in the ocean underneath maybe 200 feet of water or so. So something interesting to think about. All right, so over in this direction here, we can see a couple of creek channels kind of winding back up in there. The one to the right is the Los Osos Creek channel, and where it comes into a Y there, the one that goes off to the left, that's the Choro Creek channel. So there's two freshwater creeks that dump into the bay. But you know, we live in a seasonally dry climate, and usually we have freshwater dumping in during the wintertime and not much dumping in during the summertime. With that drought that we had earlier this winter, I'm sure there was very little water dumping in, but now, you know, there's a decent amount, and we got another big rainstorm coming in here, so we're probably going to get another good flush of fresh water into the bay. We'll talk more about the eelgrass later, but as I mentioned on the Sweet Springs field trip, we saw a huge decrease in the eelgrass in the bay for a while, and I think part of the reason was that we had a drought that was causing some physiological troubles for the eelgrass and possibly causing disease and some other stresses. All right, so this area is called Siena's View. So if you're trying to come out here and figure out where I was, this is Siena's View. Hello.
Hello.
Well, here's that wallflower that we saw yesterday. I'm not even going to try and pronounce the name of that one. That was a pretty tough one. So all along here, once again, we can see the shells here, the Native American middens. Got more of our black sage here on the left. Coast live oaks. Yet another look at our dusky-footed woodrat condominium over on the left. Continue walking around. Yeah, here's a good example of this plant that we haven't seen yet before. This is fuchsia flowering gooseberry. Beautiful flowers on it right now. So fuchsia flowering gooseberry is what we call that one. I know you guys are probably wanting me to do this trick again. See if this will help you remember what this particular plant is. Ooh, that one's That one's very sticky. That is the sticky monkey flower. Yes. All right, keep going down the trail. You can see we have our ferns again in this sheltered area along the side of the path. All right, one of the things I wanted to talk about here today was another symbiotic relationship. A lot of people would just call this stuff moss, but in fact, it's what we call a lichen. So a lichen is L-I-C-H-E-N, and a lichen is a symbiotic relationship between two different organisms. It's actually a type of fungus and a type of algae. And so basically what's going on is that the fungus is the part that you can see. And there's lots of different types of lichen. There's lichen that's growing like right on the branch. It's like an encrusting lichen. Then we have some of this longer lichen that hangs down. They actually call this lace lichen because it hangs down like a lace. So this is lace lichen. So the physical part that you see here, this is actually the fungus part. So the fungus part is the home, and then the algae live inside that. Now, fungus are interesting in the fact that they're not plants and they're not photosynthetic. They're actually heterotrophs. But in this case, really what they're doing is they're giving the algae a place to live, and the algae are photosynthesizers. So the algae photosynthesize and they give the fungus some of that energy. In exchange for that, the algae gets a nice safe place to live, and it also gets some essential nutrients and minerals that the fungus can pull out of whatever surface they're living on, either the air or perhaps the tree branch that they're living on, but mostly it's out of the air. So these are not parasitic. I know they're growing on these trees, but this is definitely a commensal relationship. This symbiotic relationship is not harming the tree at all. It's not like sucking the juices out of the tree or anything like that. It's just living on the tree as a habitat. So we call that a commensal symbiotic relationship, in the fact that it's just living there and it's not impacting the host organism at all. It's just living on it. But the other symbiotic relationship is the mutualistic relationship of the algae and the fungus. So that's a pretty cool relationship. More flowering ceanothus here on the left. Sagebrush, black sage, back into the ceanothus. So more about biological constraints on the organisms out here. Yeah, at least it stopped raining. So as I mentioned, wind is a major biological constraint. So wind plays a big factor on both the wind pruning, as I described earlier, but also in desiccation, just the physical drying out. Oh, we got a nice bird up here standing on the post. That is a scrub jay. Please don't call them a blue jay. Birders hate it when you do that. That is the scrub jay. They are technically a type of jay, but there's many different types. Well, there's two of them here. So that is a scrub jay. So once again, the wind plays a major factor in these plants where they can live. The sandy soil, which you get a great view of here, also plays a big factor. There's not a lot of nutrients in sand, and sand also doesn't hold a lot of moisture. The moisture just percolates right down through it, and so that is a very stressful environment for plants to try and live in. The fact there's not a lot of nutrients, and it just doesn't hold moisture very well. But we're seeing a plant, although it's not looking so great right now, that we saw yesterday, and that is the silver bush lupin, or sometimes called the dune lupin. Look, they even have another name here, the coast silver lupin. So lots of common names for that one. And who remembers what that one can do? That has that symbiotic relationship where it can fix nitrogen. So that's a nitrogen fixer. Just heard something. Ooh, bunny rabbit. Cool. I hope that shows up on the video. He was right next to the trail there. That was a cottontail bunny rabbit, cottontail rabbit. So there's definitely coyotes out here and bobcats. In fact, there are 22 different mammal species that live out here. There's 8 reptiles and 4 amphibians. So lots of different organisms. There's over 100 species of birds that have been found out in the Elfin forest, or if you want to call it, the elephant forest. So a little more information about the Chumash Native Americans. So they date them back at least 9,000 years ago, but possibly even longer. More of that nice silver bush lupin, getting close to blooming. A little more of the story about the black brant. All right, so here's the black brant that we talked about yesterday. Amazingly, these birds are flying over 5,000 miles to get to Morro Bay every year. And as I mentioned, they feed almost exclusively on the eelgrass. I saw quite a few in the bay a couple weeks ago on a field trip. They're usually a little bit further out in the bay where there's eelgrass beds. You don't usually see them back over here. There's a large, whoa, there's a large flock of birds down there. Look like some type of duck. Pull my binoculars out and see if we can figure out what those are. A long ways away. Ooh, a scop, perhaps. I'll post a picture and the name here once I get back. It's hard to tell. They're a long ways away. But yeah, it's hard to maybe tell in the video even. There are quite a few birds down there. Probably a couple hundred or so. A couple folks out, a couple hardy folks out kayaking. That's pretty cool. It's a beautiful day actually, just a little bit of rain. We'll see when the storm comes in how strong it's supposed to be. It's supposed to be a pretty good storm. We will see. As I mentioned before, there are trails that lead up to each of the streets. There's probably 8 or 10 different entrance points to the forest. So basically every street has its own entrance, which is great for the folks that live in Los Osos because there's lots of ways to access the forest. And you can take your dog out here. I was going to bring my dog, but decided not to because I thought it might be kind of hard to film and hold on to my dog's leash at the same time. So I've been talking about the different communities that we see out here in the Elfin Forest. Remember at the bottom, we are in that oak manzanita complex. There's a greater soil moisture down there, more nutrient-rich soils. In the middle area here, we have kind of more of an open area. We call this a dune scrub. So dune scrub ecosystem. And then as we move up back towards the top, we're going to get back into that chaparral. And because we're on the coast here, they actually call it the maritime chaparral. So the maritime chaparral is a very thick growth of shrubs. And we talk about how the cowboys used to wear chaps, right? So if you've ever tried to bust through some of these plants, they're very hard and spiny. And so the chaps apparently were short for the chaparral that they used to have to bust through before there were trails and things like that. So more of the ceanothus here off to the left. Obviously in California, these plants have to be well adapted for dry conditions. With our Mediterranean climate, we oftentimes get almost all of our rainfall in about a 4 to 5 month period of time. Sometimes it'll rain over about 6 months, but sometimes it's as short as 4 months. So that means a lot of these plants have to go 6 months and sometimes 8 months without any water. And of course that is very stressful on these plants, and that means they're going to have special adaptations to deal with that very dry environment. And one of those is to have light colored leaves. The leaves, just being lighter color, are going to reflect more of the sunlight and allow them not to dry out as much as they would if they had dark leaves. In addition to that, you can see that most of these plants have fairly small leaves. So reducing surface area is also going to prevent you from drying out as quickly. As we saw with the oak trees, and as we can see here with the ceanothus, the leaves are tough and waxy. Of course, the oak trees are much tougher and waxier, but those tough, waxy leaves mean that they're going to be able to withstand drying out a little bit better than if you were a big, broad, fleshy leaf that was soft. So we can continue up towards the top here. Fog does play an important role. When we do get a lot of fog in this area, it can actually count as measurable precipitation. And so as we move into the summertime and there's more and more fog, that's going to be an important contribution to the moisture for these plants, and just allow them to be able to persist a little bit better than if there was no fog at all. So definitely now we're starting to transition back into that maritime chaparral. One of the things you'll see as we've walked throughout the forest is this fencing. So in some places where people are bad, you have to put in a big physical plastic fence. Doesn't look good, but it prevents people from going out into the habitat and causing damage. So hopefully over time we'll be able to train the people and don't go in those areas. A lot of it is just the vegetation growing up enough to prevent the easy access to those areas, and then they can just put one of these more symbolic fences in, and that's just a single strand of wire. They'd prefer to do that because people hopefully will just respect the ecosystem and not want to take off out into the middle there and cause damage. But unfortunately, some people are not respectful, and they will continue to go out into the forest even though there's signs saying not to, and there's signs saying revegetation in progress, and that's when they have to put up those plastic fences. All right, one of the questions on your worksheet is, Why are there so many different communities in such a small area? Well, as you can see, there's lots of changes that happen over a relatively small area. Here at the top, this area here faces to the southwest, so there's lots of sunshine. We're also at the very top of the hill, so there's lots of wind coming in off of the ocean. And because of that, this is a stressful environment, so you have to have organisms that are well adapted for a dry climate, for high winds, and for not a lot of soil moisture. So this is where we have the maritime chaparral, right? So it's very well adapted to a dry environment. As we moved a little further down in the elevation, the open areas is more of that dune scrub habitat. So a little harsher, not as many big plants in the dune scrub. And then down towards the bottom of the hill, once some water starts to gather and the soils become a little bit more productive over time, we get into that oak manzanita complex. And that once again is an area where it's less stressful. There's not as much wind down there. There's more soil moisture, and the soils just have a little bit more nutrients in there that allow those larger plants to grow. Once we drop off the side of the hill, then we get down into that freshwater wetland / riparian zone. And then once you get down into the area that's inundated by salt water, that's going to be your saltwater marsh. So we're almost done with the field trip here. Not much further to go. Hopefully seeing a lot of these plants a second time is going to reinforce some of these names. And I think I just walked past the exit point. I did. This was my exit point back here. So lots of exit points. They do have it marked. I just wasn't paying attention and walked right by it. But I didn't go too much further by it. One of the things I did mention, as you can see, these floating barges out there in the bay, those are oyster farms, and I'll hopefully get a chance to go paddleboarding out there. Get a nice day, I can go out there and visit those oyster farms. The one on the left is called the Morro Bay Oyster Company, and the one on the right is the Grassy Bar Oyster Company. So they're two locally owned businesses that farm oysters. So it's a pretty cool farming process that's actually very sustainable. All right, so hopefully you enjoyed that trip. If you ever get a chance to come out to Los Osos, there's a lot of beautiful places to visit. And the great thing to think about with these two locations that we visited on this first day of virtual field trips is the fact that these areas were not like this not very long ago. They were torn up. They had lots of non-native species that were living in them. And these areas are now, I wouldn't say fully restored because the work is never done, but they have come back pretty close to their natural state. One of the other things I did want to mention is hopefully you notice a difference between here and Sweet Springs, and the fact that, you know, this is all native vegetation in here now. There are no eucalyptus trees or Monterey cypress, and you can see the difference. There's a lot more birds in this area, and there's just a lot more organisms overall because we have all native vegetation and there are no invasive plants, especially ones like the eucalyptus. All right, that's the end of the field trip. Email me if you have any questions.